The courtroom air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every creak of the wooden benches, every rustle of a sleeve sounded louder than it should have, pressing against the ears of those gathered. And there, at the center of it all, she stood, silent still and terribly exposed. "Remove your jacket," the bailiff said, his voice flat, his gaze avoiding hers. The words landed like a stone in water, sending ripples of shock through the room. Whispers stirred. A woman in the front row gasped quietly. The order wasn't barked in anger, but delivered with the dull certainty of someone who had grown too used to watching dignity dismantled one command at a time. She didn't move. Her hands, calloused but slender, hung loosely at her sides, betraying no tremor. Her face was a mask of composure. But there was something in her eyes, something restrained, like a storm being held back by sheer willpower. "Lieutenant Mara Vance," the bailiff continued, his tone firmer now, "remove your jacket before the verdict." The judge did not look up. Papers shuffled on the bench, the ritual prelude to yet another pronouncement of judgment. It wasn't until a moment later, as if on some delayed cue, that his gaze flicked toward her. She wasn't like the others who'd stood before him, and he knew it. The lines on her face spoke of years lived in harsh places. The faint, nearly invisible scar along her temple caught the courtroom's harsh fluorescent light. She carried herself with a posture too straight for the accused, too unbending for someone on the verge of humiliation. And still she didn't move. The murmurs grew louder, bouncing between the wooden walls. There was no official charge against her that day. Only an inquiry, a word that sounded sterile, but had already shredded her reputation. She was a decorated combat medic, but now she stood accused of conduct unbecoming. The phrase was as vague as it was dangerous. The order to remove her jacket wasn't just about protocol. Everyone knew that. It was about breaking her. A young clerk, barely out of law school, avoided her eyes as he muttered to the man beside him. Why doesn't she just do it? Why indeed? Because Mara Vance understood that sometimes silence was louder than defiance. Her jacket wasn't just fabric. It was the last remnant of the life she had built through blood and sacrifice. That olive drab shell still smelled faintly of rain from the day she had carried a wounded boy 3 miles through a flooded valley in Kandahar. The right sleeve still bore a faded smudge of oil from repairing a field generator during a blackout. Each thread told a story, and they were asking her to peel it away in front of strangers who would never understand. She thought of the men she'd served alongside, the ones who'd never come home. She thought of the one who had. And she thought of the tattoo. Underneath that jacket, hidden across the plains of her back, inked into her skin years ago in a dusty alleyway in Kabul, was something no one in this room had seen, something she had sworn would remain hers alone. But the courtroom didn't know that, not yet. Her mind drifted briefly, almost unwillingly, to the moment that tattoo was born, the buzzing of the needle, the sharp sting, the mix of pain and purpose. The artist had been a wiry Afghan man with steady hands and the solemnity of a priest. She hadn't wanted decoration, she'd wanted a vow. She blinked back to the present. The bailiff stepped closer, his hand hovering near her sleeve as though he might take matters into his own hands. And the room, every lawyer, every spectator, every stenographer, watched complicit in their silence. Mara's silence, however, wasn't consent. It wasn't surrender. It was a wall. There had been a time not long ago when she wasn't standing here like this, when she wasn't being made into a spectacle. That time smelled of sand and diesel, of cordite and sweat. It was hot, always hot. And the sun didn't just burn, it branded. She'd joined the military younger than most. Her father had been a machinist, her mother a teacher. Their lives had been quiet, modest, safe. But Mara had felt something gnawing inside her. A hunger for purpose. For the kind of meaning that couldn't be found in a classroom or a factory. The recruiters had promised her challenge. They hadn't lied. The first year had been brutal. Her palms blistered, her voice hoarse from shouting drills, her nights spent on the edge of sleep, waiting for the next demand. But somewhere in that crucible of mud and exhaustion, something inside her had hardened into steel. Then came the deployment. The first body she held had been a boy, no older than her youngest brother. His blood had soaked through her gloves, hot and thick, before his breath left him entirely. The second body, the third, the 10th, they all left pieces of themselves with her. But she didn't break. And in that hell, in that constant din of rotors overhead and boots hitting gravel, she made a choice. If she survived, she would carry those who didn't, not just in memory, but on her very skin. That was the vow she made, the night she walked into that Kabul alleyway. The tattoo, hidden under layers of uniform and jacket, wasn't art. It was a ledger of names. The names of the fallen. The judge didn't know that as he peered over his glasses, watching this silent standoff. The bailiff didn't know it as his fingers inched closer. The murmuring spectators certainly didn't know, their curiosity gnawing at their patience. All they saw was a woman in uniform standing too still, refusing an order she had no power to contest. But there was more here, there always was. The bailiff's fingertips grazed her sleeve, and finally Mara moved. Not quickly, not with anger, but with the controlled precision of someone choosing each motion deliberately. She reached for the zipper of her jacket. A collective breath held. The zipper moved an inch, maybe two. The fabric shifted slightly, revealing nothing yet. Her silence deepened. Because she knew, once the jacket came off, there would be no turning back. The courtroom didn't yet know what that meant. But they would. The zipper's teeth rasped softly as it moved further down, the slow descent of metal against metal. Each inch felt like a tolling bell, like the measured strokes of some grim countdown. The bailiff stepped back, unsure now, unsure if he'd forced her compliance or awakened something he couldn't yet name. The jacket, heavy with sweat and rain and years of service, sagged off her shoulders. The room leaned forward, even the hesitant judge shifting in his seat, as though gravity itself was dragging them closer to whatever truth waited beneath. The olive fabric slid from her arms, and for the first time the courtroom saw her bare forearms, marked with faint pale lines that were neither deliberate nor decorative, thin reminders of shrapnel and surgeries. Her skin was a map of stories no one had asked to read. Mara folded the jacket carefully, almost reverently, laying it across the table in front of her. She didn't toss it aside. She couldn't. It wasn't just a jacket. Her undershirt clung to her shoulders and back, damp in spots from the heat of the room, outlining the contours of muscle carved not from vanity but from survival. "Turn around," the bailiff said, his voice quieter now, as if something in her stillness was beginning to unsettle him. She did. The murmurs stopped. Her back faced the judge, the jury box, the gallery, every watching eye. And then the fabric stretched, strained, and flattened against the truth inked across her skin. The tattoo was large, sprawling, and it wasn't some careless flourish of color. It was deliberate. Stark black lines, etched with precision, names, rows of them, each letter clear and unflinching, a roll call of the fallen. Underneath the names, a single emblem, worn, simple, unmistakable. The insignia of a unit that had been officially disbanded years ago, a unit whispered about in reports that never made the evening news. The judge's hand froze halfway to his gavel. His mouth opened, then closed again. Because he knew that insignia. Once, long ago, he had signed deployment orders that bore that same emblem. He remembered the classified briefings, the urgent calls in the night. He remembered, too, the letter that had crossed his desk one grim afternoon. The one that listed the casualties, so many casualties, that came from one particular mission. And now here they were. On her back, the courtroom's silence deepened into something almost sacred. The whispers had died, replaced by an awareness that none dared name aloud. The bailiff stepped back, as if he'd touched something he shouldn't have. The young clerk in the corner dropped his pen, the clatter jarring in the stillness. Even the air felt different, thicker, somehow charged. The judge leaned forward, his voice low, more to himself than anyone else. "Those are..." He didn't finish the thought, because finishing it would mean acknowledging that this wasn't just a woman on trial. This was a memorial in human form. Mara didn't turn back around. She stood there, her back bared, her silence a roar that none of them could unhear. And in that silence, memories stirred in the minds of those watching. The judge remembered faces, photographs stapled to reports, young men and women whose lives had ended too soon. He remembered the burden of those signatures, the weight of sending them into danger. The bailiff, younger, thought of his father, who had served, who had never spoken of what he saw, who had come home quieter than he had left. The gallery thought of brothers, sisters, neighbors, friends, faces that belonged to names, names that might have been inked across that broad canvas of skin. Still, Mara didn't speak. She didn't need to, because the tattoos said everything. The judge's fingers trembled slightly as he removed his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, buying himself seconds he didn't know how to spend. He had entered the courtroom certain of his role. He was the authority, the arbiter, the voice of law. But now he felt small. Look, because authority means little when confronted with sacrifice. Lieutenant, he began, but the word felt wrong. Too formal, too detached. She turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting his with a steady calm that seemed to reach past him, as if she were looking through him, into some place deeper. And finally she spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Every one of those names, she said, the words low even, died so others could live. The sentence wasn't for pity, it was a ledger entry. And then softer, almost as if to herself but loud enough for all to hear. I carry them because someone should. The words hung there, not demanding response, not inviting argument. The judge looked down at his notes, at the documents stacked before him, and felt suddenly ashamed of the ink on those pages, the accusations, the inquiries, the bureaucratic language. It all seemed hollow now, paper thin against the weight of those names. In the gallery, someone stood. No one saw who moved first, but suddenly half the room was on their feet. Not in applause, not in uproar, just standing because sitting felt wrong. The bailiff, the same man who'd told her to strip her jacket away, lowered his head. The silence had shifted again. It was no longer the silence of discomfort. It was respect. The judge cleared his throat, the sound dry, strained. He glanced again at her back, then at her face, and something inside him, some old, long-dormant part of him, stirred. He remembered the oath he'd taken before the bench, the promise to serve justice. And he realized that sometimes justice wasn't about rules. It was about recognition. Lieutenant Vance, he said, this time with the weight of something human behind the title, I think that will be enough. Mara reached for her jacket, not quickly, not desperately, carefully. She lifted it, slipped her arms back through the sleeves, and zipped it up, sealing the names away again. Not erased, not forgotten, but protected, as they had always been. The verdict was never read aloud that day. There were papers, yes, and signatures, but those things felt like an afterthought, barely noticed beneath the gravity of what had been revealed. When she left the courtroom, no one spoke. They didn't need to. They simply stepped aside. Some stories are told in silence, in ink, and in names carried by those strong enough to bear them, and Mara Vance, quiet, unyielding, unbowed, was one of them. In the stillness that followed her exit, the judge remained seated, staring at the empty space where she had stood. He whispered something so faint the stenographer couldn't catch it. It might have been an apology, or a prayer. But whatever it was meant for the name she carried. Because once you've seen a thing like that, once you've seen someone willing to strip themselves of armor to reveal the weight they carry, you don't forget, and you don't stay the same. Outside, the courthouse steps were slick from a thin, cold rain. The kind that seeped into collars and cuffs, finding skin no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself. Mara descended them without haste, each footstep deliberate, her boots hitting the stone like punctuation marks in a sentence only she understood. The crowd that had gathered didn't cheer. They simply moved aside, parting in a way that felt almost instinctive, as if something about her presence told them that noise would be an intrusion. An elderly woman, wrapped in a faded shawl, raised her hand slightly as Mara passed. Fatiha. Not to touch her, not to stop her, just a small gesture of recognition, a salute without words. Mara didn't acknowledge it outwardly, but something softened in her face, a fleeting trace of warmth before the composure returned. Behind her, the doors of the courthouse opened again, and the bailiff stepped out. His eyes scanned for her, found her at the base of the stairs. He hesitated. Moments earlier, he had been an enforcer, firm, unquestioning, sure of his role. But now, as he looked at the back of that olive jacket, he felt the sharp ache of guilt. He remembered the moment he had asked her to remove it, his voice sharp, authoritative. He hadn't thought about what it might mean. He hadn't thought about her at all, really. He thought only of procedure. And now that felt thin. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small folded note, a scrap torn from his own notepad. He hadn't planned on giving it to her. He hadn't even known why he wrote it. But as she paused at the edge of the street, waiting for a break in the traffic, he called out softly, "Lieutenant." She turned, her expression unreadable. He didn't come closer, he just held out the note. Mara took it without looking at it, slipped it into her jacket pocket, and turned back toward the street. The bailiff didn't expect thanks, he didn't deserve them. But he hoped she would read the words later, "I'm sorry, and thank you." The traffic parted. Mara crossed. The world around her seemed oddly quiet for a city street, the kind of quiet that comes when people choose not to break it. A bus driver at the corner station stood straighter as she passed. A teenager on a bicycle paused mid-pedal, staring, then lowering his head in something that wasn't exactly a nod, but wasn't nothing. Mara moved through it all, carrying herself like someone who had learned long ago not to expect kindness, but who carried grace anyway. The tattoo beneath her jacket wasn't visible anymore, but the weight of it was. Everyone who had seen it would carry a piece of it now, even if they didn't want to. Inside the courthouse, the judge remained seated on the bench long after the room had cleared. He thought about the names, he thought about the ink, he thought about how his voice had faltered when he'd tried to speak. And for the first time in years, he thought about the oaths he had made not just as a judge, but as a man. He took off his glasses, set them carefully on the bench, and rubbed his temples. There would be paperwork, he knew. There always was, reports to file, decisions to justify. But in the quiet of that empty courtroom, he felt a truth he couldn't write in any report. Some verdicts are not spoken, they are lived, and Mara Vance had lived hers. Far down the street, Mara turned the corner, the courthouse faded from view. She didn't look back, she never did. The rain thickened, cold drops sliding down the back of her collar. She didn't flinch, she'd endured worse. She would endure this too. Somewhere inside that olive jacket, the folded note rested against her ribs. She would read it later, perhaps in some quiet room with only the sound of the rain for company. And when she did, she might allow herself a breath, a pause, a rare moment where the weight she carried didn't feel so crushing. But not now. Now she walked, because that was what she did. She carried. She walked, and the world, even in its silence, even in its hesitation, moved around her, slowly learning, slowly remembering what it meant to stand in the presence of someone whose strength did not need to be shouted to be known. The courthouse doors would close, the files would be stacked. The papers would yellow. But the image of that tattoo, the roll call of the fallen etched in black across her back, would remain. It would haunt. It would humble. And for those who saw it, it would not fade. Because there are truths that once revealed cannot be unseen. And there are people who once met cannot be forgotten.